thank you to everybody for coming. Thank you to Marilyn and for the MBR Jump Foundation for helping me to give this lecture about a project I've been working on for the last decade. It might be a bit different from some of the lectures you might have seen on this program in the past. I'm not an academic, I'm an artist, primarily a painter, but I do have a keen interest in history. And so it was the combination of these two elements, the history and the art, that led me to this project. It began in 2008. I was doing a project, I wanted to look at the British Empire, and I needed something to represent the colonies, the protectorates of the British Empire between the two great wars. And I really stumbled upon this idea of the postage stamp. It became the perfect vessel for portraying this history, had all the hallmarks of the era, the imagery, personages, the symbolism. And so in 2009, I showed this work at the Truman Brewery. I took these original postage stamps and I recreated them 7 times the size of the originals in ink and oil on canvas. And this really led me on to the next project I worked on, based on the Ottoman Empire. Of course, the British Empire, the European powers intrinsically linked to the Ottoman Empire at the end of the 19th century. And I started to look at the Ottoman vilayets, the provinces, specifically the Middle Eastern provinces, and how at the end of the 19th century the empire would disintegrate and eventually become the Middle Eastern, the colonial states, the states that you see appearing in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. Of course, stamps, they represent all of these points about a certain time that's gone past. They're a snippet of history. They represent all of this period. But really, I'd like to talk to you about the history behind them. And so I'm going to start talking about specific stamp paintings. I'm going to start here with this one. This one is from the Ottoman Empire in 1863. It's one of the first paintings that I created. It's an interesting period. At the time, the Ottoman Sultan is Abdulaziz. You can see here the two greatest features, this kind of calligraphic monogram. It represents the Ottoman Sultan. He's also the Caliph of Islam, the paramount ideologist of Islam. And each of the Ottoman Sultans will be given one of these calligraphic monograms, a kind of signature. They all work on a basic design. You have the thug, these 3 lines that come down, and the hansa, this kind of swish. And the names of the Sultan will be combined into this. Abdulaziz particularly has the victorious written at the end of this. And it's during Abdulaziz's reign that basically the debt crisis that breaks out in the Ottoman Empire takes place. It leads to a lot of problems, territorial problems. There's an outbreak, a revolt in the Balkans in 1875, and it is put down heavily by the Ottoman troops. There are massacres, and this gets the Russians involved. They want to protect their Orthodox subjects in the Balkans. So the Russian-Turkish War begins in 1877-78. It's a huge defeat for the Ottoman Empire. They lose control of much of the Balkans, but the European powers looking to balance the power between the European states, take away a bit of that power from Russia. After this war, the Treaty of Berlin takes place in 1878, and this really changes the status quo of the European powers towards the Ottoman Empire. They begin to think that the territorial integrity of the empire is not so important, and the provinces of the empire start to come up for grabs. In this treaty, Britain is awarded Cyprus, and it's indignation towards this awarding of Cyprus to Britain that leads the French to be given the protectorate right over Tunisia. They occupy the country in 1881. This is a stamp from that period. It depicts the Bey of Tunis, the traditional ruler in Tunisia. At the time, he would have ruled under the suzerain of the Ottoman Sultan, and he continues in power under the French control. In 1882, problems in Egypt, the power of the Khedive, he's got the country into a huge debt crisis. They're heavily indebted to the European powers, and so the army starts to rise up, the Arabi revolt, and the Khedive is in trouble. He's going to be removed from power, so the British, they step in and they invade the country in 1882. And they stay on in the country pretty much until 1952, the army. This stamp depicts the citadel in Cairo. There was one of the largest garrisons of British troops was here. Again, the French have long-standing interests in Egypt. They are unhappy with the British presence in the country, and so this causes a diplomatic problem. It's not really resolved until 1904. You have the Entente Cordiale between the French and the British, and the French accept the idea of Britain being in the British forces being in Egypt with the protectorate over Morocco. So the French start the protectorate over Morocco, they invade, and their forces take control in 1912. Just to confuse the picture in North Africa a little bit more, the Spanish have long-standing interests in North Africa, and so to appease the Spanish, the French allow the Spanish to take control of 3 enclaves in Morocco. In the north, just across the Mediterranean from Spain, you have Spanish Marruecos. In the south, just above their territory of Spanish Sahara, which becomes Western Sahara, you have Cabo Juby, this stamp on the left here, a small enclave below the river, and you have Ifni, a very small enclave on the Mediterranean coast. The Spanish had long-standing interest there, and they in fact wouldn't leave this territory until 1969. But I want to get back to the 3 primary French colonial states in North Africa. I'm going to start talking about Algeria. Algeria was invaded in 1830. It was occupied, of course, before all of the happenings in the Balkans. Very early on, France is still a monarchy. They still have this expansionist policy. Attitudes towards colonial states are different. It's in the earlier days. And so you really see this represented in the stamps of Algeria. You see no sign of the local aspect of the community. You see no Arabic, despite it being the mother tongue of the area. You see no symbols of Islam. You just see this very dominating symbol in the bottom left-hand corner of the République Française, showing that they're the paramount power. And in fact, Algeria became part of France proper. They actually made the coastal districts departements of France. Move forward 50 years, and the protectorate of Tunisia is a different system, and the attitudes are changing, the amount you can absorb the territory into your realm is changing. And so you see this in the stamp of Tunisia. The Arabic is present for the mother tongue, the symbol of Islam, the crescent moon and the star on the left is featured. But again, on the right here, slightly obscured by the franking, is the badge of the République Française. Again, they're saying, we are the paramount power over this territory. By the time Morocco becomes a protectorate in 1912, the attitudes change considerably. They leave much of the administration in place, and you really see that in the stamps. There's no symbol really of the French Republic in these stamps. If you didn't know the stamp was from that period, you wouldn't be able to tell. The only symbol is that you see the Arabic translated into the French. And as I said, the French had long-standing interests in Egypt, and you can see this reflected in the stamps. This stamp is from 1888 on the left, It's actually 6 years after the British occupation, but it's based on a design from before the British occupation. And you can see the French aspect to the stamp. You can see the influence. The Arabic is translated into the French language. And it also shows this links to the old regime, the Ottoman regime. Their primary translation on their stamps was into French. Move forward to 1914, and the British have turned this occupation of the country into a protectorate. And you can see now this British influence creeping into the stamps, the Arabic translated into the British language. And this stamp's very interesting. It's actually a design from 1914, right at the start of the protectorate. But this overprint actually makes this stamp from 1922. In 1922, Egypt gains its nominal independence from the British. I say nominal because, of course, the British forces stay on in Egypt. It causes a political problem. You can see here the 1922, it's quite vague, but 1922 written at the bottom, and the Kingdom of Egypt in Arabic running across with the crown. The British presence in Egypt after this independence causes a level of political instability in the country. You've got this triumvirate interest in the country. You've got the king who wants to continue to rule in the traditional aspect. You've also got this constitutional parliamentary government that is trying to move forward along Western lines of governance. And you've also got the British. They're trying to look after their interests in the country, and all these things to come together to cause this period of real political instability in the country right up until 1952, when the free officers take control. The king is removed. But the stamps from 1922 till 1952 feature heavily the monarch. His family is predominant in these stamps. There are many examples. I'm just showing this one. It's a stamp from 1951. It's King Farouk, the last king of Egypt, and it's from his marriage to his second wife, Queen Nariman. This stamp is a very interesting stamp to produce because actually one of the relatives of Queen Nariman asked me to paint this stamp for her. But this period of political instability is not just relative to Egypt. It's happening throughout the Middle East. In Syria, between 1934, when the country becomes a republic, until 1952, you have 10 heads of state. So that's a lot of heads of state. On the stamps, 5 are featured. This is enough. This is a beguiling array of heads of state. And during this period, there's a difference in government. Some of them are parliamentary. Some of them don't work out. They become military regimes. And it really leads up until 1958, and they unify with Egypt. This period where they're trying to work with parliamentary governments in the Middle East, it has varying levels of success. It's not very successful. It leads to a lot of these people starting to look at ways of governing different ideas, different aspects. You have the rise of Islamism, the Muslim Brotherhood, you have the rise of socialism, and also the rise of fascism. That leads quite well onto the last territory in North Africa removed from the Ottoman realm. In 1911, Libya is occupied by Italy, and these stamps are very, very interesting. In design aspect, they have a very strong fascist design. Although, in theory, the occupation of Libya was not along fascist lines, certainly Mussolini takes power just after the occupation, and so events that happen in the country are definitely linked to the fascist government. And you see this fascistic design in these stamps. But what's also interesting about these stamps is they have very strong allegorical symbolism in them. You see on this stamp, you see the winged victory, and she stands in front of the minarets of the Tripoli skyline. But it's not just the winged victory. You see these arms holding aloft a mural crown. A mural crown is a representation of city walls. It's this idea of power, and it's actually related to Sybil, who's the Roman mother goddess. And so this links back to historic events in North Africa. She was selected as the patron of the war against the Carthaginians, in the 2nd century BC. And these wars lead to the loss of the Empire of Carthage and the control of North Africa by Roman forces. And so it's this way of linking this past with the present occupation. You see again this kind of classic representation. Here again the mural crown, the representation of the walls, but here it's more an image of, it's a personification of Italy. It's the Italian Tarita. It's this woman who personifies the Italian nation. It's a very beautiful express stamp. It's an express delivery, of course. And again, you see these fascist design elements in this stamp. The local dates have been turned into this kind of border structure, and you see the beautiful palm fronds coming out. Again, this is an image of the Libyan Sibyl. It's an image from the Sistine Chapel. It's a fresco. And what happens is that when Alexander the Great invades Egypt, he founds Alexandria, and he visits this oracle in the Siwa oasis. And she proclaims him as the divine personage, a legitimate pharaoh of the Egyptians. And again, it's this kind of link between the European civilization and North Africa, again giving legitimacy. So after this, the entirety of the North Africa is taken out of the Ottoman Empire. They no longer control any of these territories, but still, they still control vast Middle Eastern territories in Arabia, in the Levant. But what of these territories are actually depicted in the postage stamps of the Ottoman Empire? Well, very little actually. The first pictorials appear in 1913. This specific set is from 1914, and you see a complete domination of imagery from the Turkish heartland, from Anatolia. They're the only pictorials to be featured on the stamps from this period. It's not until 1917 that we get our first pictorial of one of the Middle Eastern territories. This image, it's very vague. You can kind of make out the pyramids at Giza, this image of Egypt. What's interesting about this stamp is it represents loss, because by this time, as I've mentioned, 1914, the British have taken control of Egypt as a protectorate. It's been lost to the Ottoman Empire. They no longer control this territory. And this stamp comes 3 years after this event. It's really this idea of territorial loss from joining the war, joining the Axis powers. And it's seen again in 1920. These are the next images of the Middle East to feature. You have these stamps from Palestine, you have the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, and you have a sanctuary still in front of Beersheba. And again, in 1918, the British forces, they've sent a force from Egypt, and they've occupied the Levant. And in October 1918, they signed, the Ottomans signed with the Allies the Armistice of Mudros. They accept that their suzerainty over the Levant is at an end. And then these stamps appeared 2 years after this. Again, this idea of loss of territory. And then these stamps are interesting also for their overprints at the bottom. You can see these these beautiful black patterns at the bottom of the border. And this is very interesting. You see it on this very rare example of these postage stamps without these overprints on them. You can see the imagery of the Sphinx and the pyramids at Giza. And it's finally this the Ottoman government is saying, okay, we have to cover this up, we have to accept that this territory is not part of our realm anymore. And so, after 623 years of continual rule in these territories, the disillusionment of the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Empire falls apart after this during the First World War. And you start to have a new reality on the ground. The Turkish heartland, Anatolia, becomes the Turkish Republic. And these are two very interesting stamps from that period, from 1926 to 29. They're based on exactly the same plate design. Ataturk is there, very beautifully suited along Western lines. And it's very interesting to see that these stamps are 3 years apart. The first one, 1926, shows some of that hallmark of the old regime. You see the Turkish for the Turkish Republic is written in the Arabic script, as the Ottomans would have used. And 3 years later, with Ataturk wanting to emulate Europe, push himself towards Europe, he sees modernity with Europe. He's taken the Latin script as for the Turkish language, and so you see it appear here on this stamp. So, after the war, the First World War, you've got this period where there's new territorial realities on the ground, these states are being formed, and this stamp is a very interesting one to look at because it really gives an idea of these territorial states coming together. This particular stamp is for the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, the force that was sent by the British from Egypt to occupy the Levant. And at that time, they produced these stamps, 1918, to be used in these territories that eventually become the Levant, that eventually become Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, and Transjordan. And you see these new realities in the overprints that appear on these stamps. These two from 3 years later have these overprints. On the right, you see Sharq al-Urdun, east of the Jordan, representative of the new government of Transjordan, the new British mandate. And on the left, you see Palestine. This stamp's very interesting. You see Palestine and then, of course, Palestine in Arabic, but you also see the translation of Palestine into Hebrew here. This is, of course, because of the Balfour Declaration. The British have agreed to try and build a Jewish homeland in Palestine. But what's really interesting about these stamps is that the objection of some of the Jewish people on the committee for the publishing of these stamps, they objected to the fact that the Hebrew just translated Palestine. So the British decided to add this. It's very hard to make out, but in these brackets here at the end you have these two initials for Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. It's really the first printed idea in stamps of this idea of the state of Israel. And so they take this trilingual aspect into 1927. You get the first dedicated stamps for Palestine. See again the Philistine translated into Hebrew, and then again in the brackets, a bit more clear on this stamp, the Eretz Yisrael, land of Israel. And the British government wanted to basically balance the important monuments in this country to each of these communities. So you see them featured on these stamps heavily. Two examples here, the Dome of the Rock, of course, important with the Muslims and the Muslim faith. And on the right you have Rachel's tomb, which is the tomb of the Hebrew matriarch, important to the Jewish community. I don't want to get too much into that struggle between the communities. It's well documented, I think everybody knows about it. But it does bring together some interesting stamps from this period. This particular one is a propaganda stamp. It's from 1938. It wouldn't have been used as a regular mail stamp. You would have attached it to an envelope. Maybe the money that you pay for the stamp would go towards funds for projects for the local community, specifically the Christian and the Muslim communities. And you see these two communities coming together in this stamp, the Christian and the Muslim community coming together and for their rights in their country against the new Jewish population. And of course this leads to the war in 1947, and you have the loss of much of the territory. Unfortunately, a lot of the Arabs, the heads of state, they were more concerned with keeping each other in check, each other's interests. And so a lot of the land is lost, it becomes the state of Israel, and what's left, what we know of today as occupied Palestine, Gaza and West Bank, become occupied by the state of Jordan and Egypt. You can see two stamps here from this period, the stamp of Jordan with the Philistine printed over the top. And you see King Abdullah, the king in the country, is wearing his traditional garb, the kind of thing he would wear when he would go to Jerusalem as the head of the guardian of the holy places. And Egypt, from the same period, you see Gaza represented on this stamp. Again, it's Gaza, part of the Arab nation, but really part of Egypt. In the north of the Levant, you have a tricky situation after the war. King Faisal, at the time, a sheikh from the Hijaz, the western coast of Saudi Arabia, he's gone with the Arab revolt and the British forces and made his way up to Damascus. And he's installed there as the new king of the Arab kingdom of Syria. This is a very interesting stamp, not particularly beautiful, but it's one of only a few editions from 1920. Here is King Faisal. You see both aspects of the man. He's in his traditional Bedouin wears on the left, very elegant, and again elegant in his western suit. And King Faisal, he would have to learn to be both aspects of this man in his struggle to get recognition not only from the European powers, but also from the people of his adopted countries. He wasn't from Syria. And so King Faisal, he has this idea in Syria of this grand Arab nationalist idea of uniting all the territories into one large state. The problem with this is that the British have made alternative agreements with the French, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and so in 1920 the French put together a force. They invade Syria, they remove King Faisal from power, and they take over the mandate for Syria. And instead of them having a grand nationalist idea for the country, they divide the country into 5 smaller statelets. You can kind of see it here on this map. In the stamps, it's represented. You see the state of Syria at the top, which largely become the Ottoman provinces of Aleppo and Damascus. You see the creation of Greater Lebanon because of the Maronite Christian community there. In the bottom left, you see, or your right, you see the Alawite state, another small state that was created on the Mediterranean for the Alawi sect. The Jebel Druze here, again, another small state created in the south for the Druze sect. And you see this interesting little territory, Sanjak the Alexandrette. This had semi-autonomy because of a large Turkic population in the country. This caused diplomatic problems between France and Turkey, almost up until the Second World War. And in order to get regular diplomatic to regularize the relationship between the two countries, they are effectively awarded the state, the Sanjak Alexandrette, which becomes Hatay province. This stamp is just before, when it has its semi-autonomy, before it gets absorbed into Turkey from 1939. You see the flag of Hatay. The name Hatay was come up with by Ataturk. It references the Hittites, the people from central Anatolia who emigrated to that region. But really, when talking about the independence of the Middle Eastern territories from the Ottoman Empire, you have to start with the Hijaz, what is now the western coast of Saudi Arabia. Everybody knows who T. Lawrence is, Lawrence of Arabia. They will know his exploits, but what you might not know is that he was instrumental in designing and publishing this series of stamps. He was sent to Cairo to work with the bureau. He found this desk job very, very boring, so he managed to get out and he went to the Hijaz to do surveys and also to help with this Arab revolt, where they would attempt to push the Ottoman forces out of the Hijaz, create a new independent state. And so he came up with this idea to legitimize this by producing these postage stamps. They're very beautiful. They throw most of the aspects of Western stamp design out of the window. Of course, this is on purpose. He doesn't want it to look like there's been a European involvement in the production of these stamps. So you see no kind of regular border. You see no numerals to represent the denomination of the stamp, just written in script at the bottom. It's quite unusual. And of course, the seal of Mecca in the middle. They came to these stamp designs. They approached originally King Hussein, who was the sheriff of Mecca at the time, and he would become the king of this new independent Hijazi government. And they asked him to give them some imagery that would reflect his new territory. And what he sent back was rather disappointing. So they decided to take it into their own hands. And so they visit the Arab Museum in Cairo. These are two images of what the interior might have looked like at the time. It's about 10 years before they would have visited. But you get an idea. You see the Mesherabia designs, you see the stucco designs, the kind of designs that they would use in this new stamp design. You see here a couple more of the different denominations of this series. Very beautiful stamps. Of course, the Hijaz doesn't last very long. In 1925, it's absorbed by the Sultan of Nejd, Ibn Saud, who would eventually become the king of Saudi Arabia. You see a stamp representing the Sultanate of Nejd. You see here it's an Ottoman stamp. You see Al-Sultaniya Nejdiya and Barid, representing the post of the Sultanate of Nejd. They would have used Ottoman stamps because as the power of the Ottomans waned, they wouldn't have had the ability to produce their own stamps, and they would have just printed over them like this. And he rules these two territories after he occupies Hijaz, kind of as semi-autonomous territories under one state. And so this stamp here is from this period, the post of the Hijaz and the Nejd. He wouldn't unite the two countries until 1934 as Saudi. What's interesting about these two stamps is, again, as I spoke earlier about the symbol, the calligraphic monogram of the Sultan, the Ottoman Sultan, and it's used again here in the stamp of Saudi Arabia. Ibn Saud has appropriated this signature, and why would he do that? Well, maybe he's trying to say, look, I'm the continuation of the power in this region. Maybe he's trying to say, I'm the paramount power. Or maybe he's trying to say, I'm now in control of the holy places at Mecca and Medina. So I think I've kind of summed up the falling apart of the Ottoman Empire and becoming the colonial states in the 1920s and 30s. So I want to change a little bit to the thematic. I want to talk about progress. When talking about progress in the Middle East, I guess a good place to start is with Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the head of Egypt between 1952 and 1970. He got closer than anybody in recent times to the idea of an Arab territorial union when he united his country Egypt with Syria in 1958. It became the United Arab Republic. But because of kind of personal ambition, again, and the dictatorial approach of the Egyptians towards the Syrian government, also political problems in Syria, this union falls apart in 1961, and with it is really the death of the idea of an Arab nationalist union. Of course, with Nasser's death in 1970, this completely falls apart. But on a local aspect, there's many signs of under Nasser. He instigates the idea of the Aswan High Dam. The country has had a long-standing problem with feeding a huge expanding population, population expanding very quickly and feeding this population. Also with the production of cotton. They need more arable land to produce cotton. It's their principal export. And so the cotton stamps, they feature heavily in the period from independence right up until the 1970s. This is just an example of a few. So the construction of the high dam would have created this new arable land, feed the population, obvious social progress there. But on a cultural note, it creates Lake Nasser. And the problem with this is that the floodplain where Lake Nasser is, hundreds of ancient Egyptian monuments would have been flooded and lost to the nation. So here's Egypt and Sudan. They approach UNESCO to put together this campaign. And so they work as a middleman between member states that want to donate towards this campaign. You see a whole series of stamps from this era depicting this campaign in Pakistan. You can see here Kuwait, United Arab Republic. And this campaign begins in 1960 with this monument in the bottom right, Abu Simbel. It's probably the biggest and most important of the monuments moved in this campaign out of this floodplain. Here it is featured in a stamp from 1914 in its original position. And this monument was moved just 50 metres higher up the cliff face and 200 metres back into the cliff face at a cost of $40 million. A huge project, but of course now one of Egypt's most important tourist attractions. At the other end of the floodplain, the only other temple really to be featured in the postage stamps is the Temple of Philae. This had already been affected by the construction of Aswan Low Dam, the British instigated project. Every year it would be flooded, silt damage to the temples, they would lose colour in the reliefs, and so it was decided this should also be moved. It was dismantled into 40,000 units, a huge project, and moved just 500 metres away onto an island on higher ground. But really, when talking about progress and big infrastructure projects in the Middle East, you should start with the Suez Canal, completed in 1869. Of course, this is a huge level of progress. It really cuts the time to get to the Far East, to get to India, of course, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. And with this, also you see a level of political stagnation, because the British, wanting to protect these interests, they leave forces in Egypt. In 1947, they agreed to move away from the Nile Delta, but they really embed themselves in the Suez Canal zone. And it's not until 1954, when Nasser agrees the evacuation of British forces. Here you can see the stamp commemorating them from 1954 on the right, that this situation gets resolved. Unfortunately, the nationalisation of the Suez Canal Company by Nasser 2 years later, there's an indignation with the British that they're very unhappy, they want to protect their interests, so they invade the country along with a French and Israeli force, very unsuccessful, international condemnation. They kind of leave with their tails between their legs, and really they lose a lot of prestige in this period. It leads the Egyptian government to look more towards the Soviet Union for funding and help. But the Suez Canal, the creation of the Suez Canal helped some territories. Aden, which was captured in 1839 by the British as a way station. Here's this event featured on a 1939 stamp 100 years later. It becomes a really important port and stopover on the way to India. And it also becomes a very important base for the prevention of piracy in the Indian Ocean and the Gulf. And so 1 year after this occupation of Aden, the British put together a campaign to attack the forces of the Qawasim tribe, the tribe that's based around Ras Al Khaimah today in the United Arab Emirates. And they had been attacking British ships for a number of years. So the British put together this 10-year campaign. They destroy the fleet of the Qawasim tribe, destroy their power, their livelihood. And this leads to a series of agreements called the Trucial Agreements, and the construction of the Trucial states, the 7 emirates that would eventually become the United Arab Emirates. But also they sign agreements with Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, and Oman, and you really see the early formation of the Gulf states that we know today. Of course, without this protection, this part of the world might look very different territorially today. So when looking at progress, of course, you have to look at the Gulf states. They are the perfect example of progress, immense progress in a very short period of time, a few decades, and this is because of oil, of course, the discovery of oil. This is a very beautiful stamp from Kuwait from 1959, 2 years before their independence. And I really see the symbolism of this progress in this stamp. You see the dhow, the traditional vessel of the time, the traditional aspect of the economy of these maritime communities, and it foreshadows the oil derrick, this future revenue for the country. And you see also Abdullah al-Salam, al-Sabah, the sheikh in Kuwait at the time. He would really take Kuwait into the modern era along European lines. And I love this stamp. I really imagine that this dhow is going to eventually, at this time it's still relevant, but it's eventually going to kind of sail past, out of the frame and into the annals of history to some extent. But you really see the transformation of these states in the stamps until 1959, and that edition for Kuwait's created. none of the Gulf states are afforded their own dedicated stamps. They all use these stamps from India. Of course, they were governed from India. They would have had these stamps. The slight hierarchy of these states is shown in the overprints. Bahrain and Oman are two examples that were afforded overprints. The Omani stamp is very beautiful. In Arabic it says Abu Sa'id. It's to commemorate the 200th year of Abu Sa'id rule in Oman. But the lesser states wouldn't have had their own overprints. They would have only been known by the franking that was put on the stamp at the time of post. But of course, with this amazing progress, you have the idea of preservation, keeping these aspects of the past society. This is a very interesting stamp, represents both of these things. Of course, the Gulf states, they want to become modern. They start to look at European ideas and institutions. And so Kuwait in 1967, they found the National Museum of Kuwait. It's the first such institution in the Gulf. And they placed this museum inside a very important structure, the Palace of Sheikh Khazal of Mahamara. Mahamara is a small emirate was at the time a small emirate between Iraq and Iran. And he had very good friendship with Mubarak al-Sabah, the Sheikh in Kuwait. And he was given this land to build this house. It's not really indicative of a Kuwaiti design of house. The traditional homes are usually one story. They have a central courtyard. But nonetheless, it's a very important building. And you can see it here. At the time, there was a museum. It has a very beautiful garden in front of the building. Unfortunately, with preservation programs, you can't always see into the future. And the Iraqi invasion in 1990, this building gets shelved and unfortunately destroyed, although there are some stories that the government in Kuwait are going to rebuild this building and save it for future generations. But the urban fabric of the architecture is changing drastically. This is a very interesting stamp from Kuwait of the Safat, the square, where in the old days it was just inside the city walls, and traders from the interior in Arabia would have come and they would have sold their wares there before disappearing back out. By 1959, you can see it's become a centre for the automobile trade. There's a big feature of these companies here. You also see this old style of water tower. It wasn't very successful. It only lasted a couple of years. But then, of course, with this modernity, you see the restructuring of these areas. The city walls are torn down. You see here the same area, only the city gate exists. You see the water tower still there. In the 50s, by the 60s, it's disappeared. You see these big projects going on in the whole of the Gulf. Of course, when you think of progress, you think of these days of Abu Dhabi, Dubai, these huge metropolises. This stamp is from Abu Dhabi from 1964. You see the traditional home of the ruler, the Qasr al-Hustan, and in the stamp it's unimpeded by roads. Only 5 years later, you see this image at the bottom of the fort, and it's surrounded by modern infrastructure programs, roundabouts, and large highways. Really, you see these signs of progress in the stamps of the Gulf countries a lot. In Kuwait, you see the building of Al-Ahmadi, the oil port. You see the oil pier, so that the deep sea vessels can stock up on oil easily. You also see the appearance of the Kuwait Airlines, very cute plane at the top. Another form of infrastructure for the country. You see progress in education. You see the building of Shuwaik Secondary School, and again the oil derrick featured that symbol of this progress in this country. You see it also in the other Gulf states, the building of the deep sea harbour at Bahrain, the building of the Saudi government railway line. I love this stamp. It is actually printed by the American banknote company. I love this stamp also because of the imagery. You see these traditional Bedouin guys, they're kind of patiently waiting for this train to get out of the way. And the building one of the first airports in the United Arab Emirates, in Sharjah, actually before that union takes place. And so all this progress, of course, It leads to the independence of these Gulf states in 1971. They're kind of the last of this colonial era to gain their independence and move towards the modernity of their independent state. And with that, really, you see the end of this period and the end of my project. So thank you very much.